Hello everybody. This will be the first in a series of 3 or 4 videos exploring deeply all the path effects present in the latest version of Inkscape. My idea is not go over every single option and button, because many of those options are not that useful or important, but rather show you everything you need to use each path effect in real life, as well as some practical tips and techniques that are essential to use them to the fullest. But before that, I want to remind you that I make videos on Inkscape and illustration every week, so if you're interested, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for more tutorials. And also, since you're there, a like and comment will help me and the channel a lot, and it's always highly appreciated. Okay, let's begin. First of all, let's define exactly what are path effects. Path effects are a feature on Inkscape that allows you to do some really awesome operations on paths. I like to think of them as extra tools that you use to do some particular things, but with the added benefit that they are non-destructive, meaning that at any time you can delete the path effect and all the changes made to the path are reverted, and that you can stack them one on top of another to get different results. To open the path effect dialog, go to Path, Path Effects. If you have selected a path, you will have the option to click on this arrow to show all the effects that you can apply to the selected object. You'll notice that each effect is separated in categories by the type or use. You have the Edit Tools category, Distort, Generate, Convert, and then you have an Experimental Effects category that could potentially not work as intended, so they are not recommended to use. The way these tutorials are going to work is that I will be dedicating one video to each category, and on this video, I will go over the effects in the Edit Tools category. In the upcoming ones, I'll go over the other categories. Starting with the most complex and arguably the most important of the category, the Corners effect. This effect allows you to round or flatten any corner automatically, with the flexibility of changing it anytime you want. It's really helpful and it can save you hours of work. Once that you apply it to a path, you see this little white circle right next to every single node. From that, you can use the node tool to change the shape of the corners with a little white circle. Very similar to the way you can round off the corners of the built-in rectangle. But of course, now you can use it with any path, not just rectangles. If you're interested in making all the corners to be equal, then the most important option will be this one, Radius. Here you can set the radius value that all corners of the path will receive. And down here you can set the unit. I would recommend you to always work on pixels. By default, you apply a fillet, which means rounding off the edges, but here at the bottom you have the option to change it to a chamfer, which means just straightening out the edges. You also have the option to apply an inverse fillet, which just inverts the rounding, a bit less useful but still a kinda cool option to have. And an inverse chamfer, which seems like it does nothing right now, but that leads us to another option here, chamfer steps. A chamfer operation looks flat only when this value is set to 1, but we can change it to make it look like a stepped version of the chamfer. Going back to the inverse chamfer option, now you can clearly see what it does. It just inverts it, like with the inverse fillet option. This final option is really important, this one that says change only selected nodes. By enabling this box, you can apply the radius and, most importantly, the corner types to individually selected corners. This way you get to mix and match different types of corners in a single path, really unlocking the power of this path effect. And those were the most important options for this effect. Everything else you can leave it as it is. You can safely ignore them. Next is the power stroke effect. This allows you to change the shape of a line or a stroke. Most of the time you want to apply it to an open path that simulates being a line, to make it look more like a traditional media stroke, though you can apply it to a closed path with some caveats. Once applied, you get a red dot for each node. You can move them around to create the shape you want. You're not limited to the amount of dots you have. If you hold Ctrl and click on a dot, a new one will be created when you drag from it. You can pull as many nodes as you need to scope the shape you want. And one important thing, the dots are not limited to the segment they were created in. You can drag them all throughout the stroke, so you have that complete freedom. Of course, you still have access to the stroke. You can still manipulate it with the object and node tool, add nodes, move the curvature, and all the changes you made with the effect will adapt to this new shape. So as you can see, this is a really powerful tool to get interesting shapes for a line. It is possible that you make the line too thick to be seen or manipulated easily. In that case, I would recommend you to enable this option here in the tool controls of the node tool. This will allow you to see the path outline clearly on top of the effect. It is important to note that when you apply this effect to a stroke, the actual shape that you are manipulating with the dots, it's another path that Inkscape places right on top of the stroke, even if it does not show on the layers and object dialog. That means that you no longer change the width with the fill and stroke dialog. Instead, you control the overall thickness with this input box. All the bumps and form changes you did will be kept when you change the thickness. One thing to keep in mind, because this shape is a path, if you want to change color, now you have to apply it to the fill instead of the stroke. And what's more, you can even give it a stroke and change its color and width using the fill and stroke dialog, like with any other object. You can get some interesting looks with this. And that was it for this effect. All the other options, you can skip them. Let's continue with the knot effect. This one is pretty simple. Basically, it allows you to create a space in the intersection between lines, like in chaotic designs. This effect works with single paths that have overlapping strokes, whether they are closed or open. Unlike with the previous effect, it does not create a shape on top of the strokes, meaning that you can work on the original path normally. After you apply it, you should see how there is a bit of a gap in the intersections to show how one line goes over another. Also notice how they are switching between going on top and above, like in the classic Celtic designs. Of course, you can still manipulate the strokes with the node tool, and the intersections will arrange themselves automatically to this back and forth. When you switch to the node tool, you should see this big round arrow. This arrow will show on the very first intersection, and by clicking on it, you can set up which line goes on top or below on that intersection. So you can make it fit with all the other ones. You can also disable the effect as well, but only for this first intersection. It would have been nice to have this option for each intersection, but I guess the effect is only meant for a very particular type of knot design. There are only two options that are worth knowing on this effect. First, with the gap length, you can make the spacing longer. And second, the gaps in both will make it so both lines have a gap. But there's a feature you should be aware of when using it. Remember that this effect only works on single paths. It does not interact with other objects. If you want multiple objects to interact with each other, you can combine the path into a single one. Just select the two shapes and go to Path, Combine. This will join the two paths into a single path made of two islands. Even if they don't look like it, now they are a single path, so the knot effect will work as intended. Simplify is the path effect version of the simplify operation in the path menu, but in real time and with a few more options. This operation will simplify a complex model by smoothing it. It's very important to note that this operation will not remove unnecessary nodes. What it does is to smooth out a path. It's clearly meant to be used with organic shapes, like the ones you draw using the pencil tool. That's why it's built into that tool. You can see it in the tool controls, and even enable the path effect version with this button. The blue markers indicate the virtual nodes that the operation is using to simplify. It's only a visual feature, you cannot edit them. The only two options that seem to do something are the complexity, which apparently defines how much simplification is doing, though to me it just crashes the program if I dare as much as to touch it, and smoothing, which defines how much it smooths sharp corners. That is, how much it destroys the original shape. I'm gonna be honest, I don't use this effect at all. This is because it's more useful when you use the pen tool to draw with a tablet. I don't like to draw with a tablet in Inkscape, and honestly I don't recommend it. What I can tell you is that this effect is by far the one that most consistently crashed my system. The offset effect is similar to the simplify effect in the sense that it seems to be the path effect version of a path operation as well. In this case, the dynamic offset, but again with the added benefit of being non-destructive, which is especially important for this operation. Once you apply this effect and switch to the node tool, you should see this orange circle. By pulling from it, you can offset the shape from all sides equally. There is no need to touch anything in the settings, everything just works out of the box, but if you're not satisfied with the way some super sharp corners look, you can play around with the join options, though to me everything just works as it is. The final effect in this category is the taper stroke. And I already mentioned this effect when we talked about the power stroke, basically saying that it's a simpler version of that effect. Taper stroke will apply a taper to any stroke you make. It's meant to make the lines created with the pen tool look like natural media, maybe like a pen or a brush. In certain ways it is more useful than the power stroke, because making tapered lines is way more common than making custom lines. After it's been applied, you control the taper with this little diamond. Unlike with the power stroke, you cannot move this control past the end node. So if you want a nice and long taper, you have to keep in mind the position of the nodes. The most important setting you have to care for in the effects dialog is this one, that controls the width. Just like the power stroke effect, taper stroke will transform the stroke into a path that you can edit as a normal stroke, though just like before you'll have to change the color as a fill, and you won't be able to use some features of the stroke style tab in the fill and stroke dialog. Because you may want to use thick strokes with this effect, the other option that you may want to keep an eye on is the join type. Extrapolated works most of the time, but if that doesn't work for you, you may want to try some of the others. And that was it for this video on the Edit Tools Path effects. We'll move on to the next category, which is the Distort effects. Hello there, we continue taking a look at the pattern effects in Inkscape. This is part 2, where we'll see how to use all the patterns in the second category, Distortion. These effects are in my opinion much more useful overall, since they are oriented to distorting already made objects. All of them work with groups, not just individual paths, which makes them even more flexible. But before continuing, I make Inkscape and illustration videos every week, so if you're interested, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. And don't forget to like and comment, it really helps the channel grow. Bend will allow you to use a path to bend another path. It has a huge amount of possible uses, it's super easy to use, and I think it's one of the most essential path effects to learn. You apply it to the object you want to bend. The effect will automatically apply a path you can use to change the shape. You need to click on this button to be able to edit it on the canvas. This is a normal straight line path, meaning you can modify it with the node tool as with any other path. You can change the shape, add and remove nodes, change the node type, etc. The effect also gives you an extra control to change the overall width with this diamond. But you'll notice that this automatic path is always placed horizontally, even if the object is set vertically. In that case, you could rotate the object horizontally and then apply the effect, or use this button to do this automatically for you. Most of the time a single straight line path is enough to do the basic bend operations, but if you want you can use your own custom path. Just copy the path you want to use, go to the path effect options, and hit this button. You still have the control to change its width if you want. You can also use the bend effect with closed paths, and you still have control over it as if it was a normal path. One very important thing to keep in mind is that all effects in the Distort category work with groups, and this is what it allows you to do some really amazing things with finished illustrations, like applying some bend to this completed tree. Pattern along path is used to repeat a path along another path, like custom dashes, but with paths instead. This is another super important effect to know how it works. This one works a bit differently than the previous one. Unlike with the bend effect, you apply it to the path you want the repeated path to go along. This time you must apply your own path, just like before. Copy the path you want and then click on this button to paste it. By default it will show like this due to an option in the set effects. You can change that with the drop-down pattern copies. Repeated will just repeat the pattern all along the path. Repeated stretched will adjust the path so it fits nicely all the way through by stretching if needed. These two options are most likely what you want. But then you have single. We'll just put a single copy, kinda useless option. And single stretched, the default option, it just stretches one path along. It's useless. If you want to bend a path, you have much more flexibility using the bend effect. You can still edit the path normally, moving the nodes with the node tool and adding and removing nodes. It all works. You also have the same width control from the bend effect to control the width. The interesting part is that you can change and modify the copied path, and that will reflect on the other one in real time. This way you have a lot of control over the way it looks. But also notice that the fill and stroke properties are not passed down to the other object. These properties are still changed by selecting the other path and changing them. There are a couple of important options in the path effect dialog that you want to know to refine the way it looks. The spacing input will change how much spacing there is between copies. The normal offset will change the up and down of the copies. And pattern is vertical will flip the copies. Here's a quick tip that's helpful for this effect that obscure the path under. You can click on this option in the tool controls of the node tool to show the outline of the path. This way you can see where it is located behind all these shapes. One thing to notice here that is super important, sadly this effect does not allow you to use group objects as patterns, only single paths. As you can see here, it only copied the moon shape, not all the other ones. This is weird because it makes complete sense that you may want to repeat more complicated illustrations along a path. Transform by 2 points is a bit of a helper tool to make scaling and rotating easier, most useful for technical illustrations that require accurate transformations. Once that you apply this effect, when you switch to the node tool you should see this new control line with 2 diamonds. One is the first knot and the other one is the last knot. By moving any of these, you will be able to control the scale and rotation, pivoting from the opposite knot. You can lock the length with this button and it will allow you to rotate the object using the last knot without scaling. You can even have a nice helper icon to let you know from where you should rotate. You can also lock the angle to scale along the angle of the line. Flip vertical and horizontal will flip the object vertically and horizontally along the line. Elastic will disable the uniform scaling that's enabled by default. You probably noticed that this effect will place the line between 2 nodes in your path. You can change this with the first node and last node input boxes to switch between different nodes' positions. Incredibly awkward way to control the position of the line. It would have been much better to be able to draw the lines ourselves. Anyway, you can also use the button from original width to place the line in the center of the path. A little note, you can use this effect with groups, but in that case you won't have the option to switch the line position between nodes. It's automatically placed in the center. The other options that are useful are stretch, which will scale the object perpendicular to the line, and offset, which will offset the object perpendicularly to the line. Envelope deformation will let you deform a path along its borders by using 4 other paths. This effect is nice to make some large-scale subtle adjustments to a finished illustration, though there are other distort effects that may be better. After it's applied, you have to click on the first button of each row to show a line path that covers the top, right, bottom and left area of the bounding box of the path. Just like with the other distort effects, this path is just a normal path that you can modify with the node tool, and do everything you could with any other normal path, including adding and removing nodes and changing its type. Any change you do will influence the area where it's located, so the way the object looks is a combination of the influence made by the shape of these 4 paths. And similar to the other distort effects, you can use your own custom path instead of the simple line path the FX brings by default. Like before, just copy the path you want. You may want to place this path closer to where it should be. Then you click on this last button on the right row. The perspective envelope is one of the most useful path effects in Inkscape. It's one of my favorite because it's so powerful and easy to use, and I think it's essential to learn. You can use it to draw objects flat and then put them in perspective, or also use it as a better and easier to use version of the previous effect we saw. Using it is super simple. When you switch to the node tool, you'll see 4 control points at the corners. Moving these points distorts the object as if it were positioned in perspective, so all you have to do is to make it match. This tool is great together with an axonometric grid. I have a tutorial on that, make sure to check out the description. In the type dropdown, you have the option to switch to envelope deformation. And now it works similarly to the way the previous effect worked with the default paths, only that you cannot bend them. I much prefer this way to make large-scale deformations, even if you don't have the option to bend them. Mostly because it's much easier and intuitive, and most of the time it's completely unnecessary to bend anything. These two options to mirror horizontally and vertically can be quite useful. Very important, don't forget this effect works with groups. That means that you can draw entirely using multiple paths, flat, and then put them in perspective using this effect. It's a great way to work in 3D in Inkscape. Lattice Deformation creates a lattice of 5 control points by 5. By moving the points, you affect the area closer to that point. I kinda hate this effect. A deformation lattice, especially one that works with groups, like this one, seems really useful. But that's until you realize that you cannot change the amount of points the lattice have. 5 by 5, it's always either too much or too little points to be that helpful. There really isn't that much to this effect. You can only change the position of the points. There is no path to curve. There's also the option to mirror the movements horizontally and vertically. And you cannot reposition the nodes to specific parts of the illustration. It's always an equal size grid. Like I said, I don't think this effect is that helpful, though I guess to make some more organic shapes it can work out. It's just annoying to see the wasted potential, because being able to have a lattice that you can change the amount of points could be extremely useful. And I cannot think of a reason why the developers did not implement that into this effect. Roughen do one thing and it does it pretty good. It just roughens the silhouette of the shape, something that will be a pain to do manually. You have no control points or anything like it. Everything is managed through the options in the path effect dialog. Global randomize is how strong is the displacement, that is, how much the bumpy silhouette pushes out. Then you have controls exclusively for the horizontal and vertical strength, not that important in my opinion, but useful if you're going for a particular look. And then is the segment size option. Here you control how big are the bumps. There are more settings, but those are the really important ones. You can safely skip everything else. One final warning, this effect, like all the Distort effects, works with groups, but you may want to be careful because the effect is applied to all objects individually. So if you have overlapping objects that share a border like shadows or highlights, then it may break the design. And we are done with all path effects in the Distort category. Next video will continue with the Generate category. Hello there. This is the third video out of a series of tutorials where we take a look at all the path effects in Inkscape one by one. Link to the playlist below. In this video, we'll see all the effects in the Generate category. But before starting, I would like to remind you to subscribe and hit the bell for more videos on Inkscape and illustration in general. Also, don't forget to like and comment if I missed something or if you have any questions. Boolean Operations allows you to perform any of the 6 Boolean operations in real time and non-destructively, though with some limitations. After you apply the effect, you'll need another path, the operand path. This is the one that will be on top in a normal Boolean operation. You'll need to copy that path and then use this button to make it interact with the original one. Now you simply move it with the object tool and it will perform a union by default in real time. You can change the type of operation by selecting the path with the effect and changing this dropdown to what you want. You can always select the operand path even if it looks invisible, but you may set an operation where it's impossible to select the original path and you can't access the options. In that case, just select the operand path and click on this button in the path effect dialog. There is some behavior that I've noticed that's different from the traditional Boolean operations. For example, in a difference, if you put an object in the center, it won't make a hole. This is another path effect that I believe looks more useful than it is in reality, and that's mainly for one single reason. You cannot use more than 2 operands. This means that, sadly, it is not possible to construct an object in real time by building them using Boolean operations, which I'm sure is the first thing that comes to mind when you think about real-time Boolean operations, so there really isn't that much of a need to use it in my opinion. Hatches is one of the coolest path effects in the program. It allows you to make very natural looking hatches. After you apply this effect to a path, it will transform it into a series of squiggly paths that will work as a type of fill. Like with all effects, you can edit the path itself in real time, and the hatches will adapt. You control the way it looks with these 2 sets of diamonds. The green ones control the direction and width. With one of the controls, you can regenerate the lines by moving it horizontally, and with the others, you control the direction and width. Think of it like an arrow you can squash and stretch to get the right configuration you want. Not the best interface in my opinion, but it works fairly intuitively. With the yellow control, you handle the bend, once again by moving the controls like an arrow. The bend hatches checkbox has to be enabled to be able to do this. Let's look at some useful options in the path effect dialog. Growth makes the width change along the path. Then there are a group of input boxes that control different parts of the line, depending on which input you change. You'll need to pay attention to the direction of the hatches to see which ones you need to change. The random group of input boxes will control how much the hatches will variate from left to right and up and down. The smooth group will control how rounded the hatches are going to be at the ends. The width group will change the width only at the area you want. You have a lot of flexibility over how the hatches look, but these controls are best understood by experimenting and seeing how they work. Power clip is one of those bizarre effects that don't do anything actually that useful. It just gives you the extra options to invert, flatten, or hide the clip. Of all of them, to me the only vaguely useful seems to be the inversion. You can only apply it to an already made clip, and once applied, all you do is to click any of these 3 boxes. Invert will just invert the clip. It does the exact same thing than using an invert clip by going to Object, Clip, Set Inverse Clip. Flatten will make it so if you apply the effect by going to Path, Object to Path, the generated shape will have the shape of the path. And Hide will just hide the clip and only show the clipping path. Sketch is another awesome effect to create unique styles, similar to hatches. This time it will create sketchy lines based on the outline of a path to make it look a bit more like natural media. If you apply it to a path with a fill, it won't look right. You'll need to disable the fill and give it a stroke. These lines are path and they react in real time to any change you make to the shape. Here are the most useful options in the path effect dialog. Strokes changes the amount of sketch lines the effect generates. Offset will handle how much these lines deviate from the original shape of the path. Stroke length max will variate the line's average length. You can get some really funky results by setting this input box really low. Displacement size changes how much the lines will deviate from the original path shape. Displacement details will make the lines less straight. Add extra lines will change how many of these lines that leave the outline of the shape are generated. I feel most of the time these lines are distracting, so I like to set this value to 0. If you do want extra lines, length max will change the length of them and how they leave the silhouette. And that's it. There are obviously more options, but those were the ones I thought were the most interesting ones. As with all generative path effects, I recommend you to just try the things out and have some fun with them. One tiny detail that may throw you off guard is that there is no way to give this path a fill normally. The easiest and most straightforward way to do this is just to duplicate this shape and remove the effect with this button, and then send this shape to be below it. Tiling is an effect that allows you to tile an object in different ways. This is one of my favorite effects. It's super flexible and what's better, it works with groups, so you have a lot of power. Once applied, you will immediately see a grid of 3 by 3 with a rectangle on the original object. The original object will be the first copy. You cannot change its position on the grid. You will also see these two control diamonds that control the horizontal and vertical separation. The true power of this effect is in the dialogues options. We have a lot to cover here. First is the row and column input boxes, which allows you to set the amount of copies. The next options can be a bit tricky to understand. Offset % will change the horizontal or vertical offset of the next row of columns, depending on which button you have toggled on. The first one for the horizontal and the second one for the vertical. A couple of things to keep in mind. The offset is only applied every second row or column, which is a common thing you see in design. And second, when you switch the offset type, it will undo any changes you had on the other offset and apply it to the new one, so you cannot stack them. Also, keep in mind you can set negative values so they move in the opposite direction. Scale will handle the scaling of the copies in one of 5 different ways. The first mode will make the entire bottom rows bigger. You can give it a negative value to make the bottom rows smaller. The second mode will make the rightmost column bigger. Again, give it a negative value to invert this and make them smaller. The third mode will make it so the bottom right objects are bigger. Give it a negative value to make them smaller. The fourth mode will just make everything uniformly bigger or smaller. And the final mode will just make everything random within the specified value. Rotate will control the rotation of the copies, again in 5 different modes. The first mode will rotate the bottom rows clockwise. You can give it all of these modes a negative value to rotate them counterclockwise. The second mode does the same, but for the rightmost column. The third mode will make it so the bottom right objects are the most rotated. The fourth one will make everything uniformly rotated. And the final mode will make the rotation random within the value set. Mirror transform will work only for rotation as far as I know, and it will make it so every second row or column you get it mirrored, but only after the first row or column, depending on the mode set for the rotation input. Minimize gaps only work with the scale options. It will make it so the separation between the shapes is equal. Split elements will let you select individual copies to give them a unique color or style separated from the other ones. You cannot modify the path or make any other change, just the style. If you want to give them all the same color or style once again, click on the button Link Styles. Finally, I want to talk about the mirroring mode. This is different than the mirror transform checkbox we saw a second ago. These modes handle how the tiling is gonna be and affect all copies. All options we saw previously will still apply no matter the mode set here. You should be able to tell what they do just by looking at the icon, but just because they look a bit confusing at first sight, I will show you what they do using a path that's similar to the shape of the icon. The first mode will just tile the shapes as they are shown in the icon, without any mirroring of any type. The second mode will mirror every other row, like in the icon. The third mode will flip horizontally and vertically every other row. The fourth mode will just flip them vertically, and so forth. All you have to do is to look at what the first 4 symbols in the icons are doing, and that's how the tiling is gonna go. Super easy once you know how it works. Clone Original is basically a slightly better clone copy. It does the same thing as far as I know, with a couple of exceptions. What's more, you have the option in the menu of using this effect to make a clone. In case you don't know, a clone is a relatively obscure feature of Inkscape, where you make a duplicate that shares all the data with the original one. So if you modify the original, the other also changes. You apply the effect to a path that you want to transform into a clone. Then you need to copy the path that will be the original, go to the Path Effects options in the clone path, and hit this button. Now every change you make to the geometry of the original will be replicated in the path with the effect. In the Path Effect options you do have some extra options, but to me they are kinda difficult to handle. You need to write the CSS and SVG attributes, and honestly, it's not worth it in my opinion. But the one thing that's different from the traditional clone operation is that with this effect you can change the style properties of the clone. They are not linked in this way. And that's a good reason to go for this effect rather than the traditional clone. Interpolate Sub-Paths will generate shapes that are the geometrical in-between of two shapes, filling in the gaps. This effect is very similar to the Interpolate Between Paths extension in the extension menu, but in real time. By the way, let me know in the comments if you want me to cover the extensions in the future. Very important, to use this effect, you'll need a single path made out of two path islands. There are many ways to do this, but the easiest way is to use the combine operation in the path menu. Combining path will transform the objects into a single path. This is not a group, meaning built-in objects and effects will be all transformed into pure paths. After this effect is applied, it will generate the shapes between two of the path islands in the path. And this is very important. It will not work with more than two islands. If there are more than two islands, the effect will pick two random ones and work on those. You can control the location of the generated shapes by editing a line path. Just click on this button. You cannot control the position of the original shapes with it, which will be very useful here. You have to manually grab the nodes of either shape and move them. Equidistant spacing will make sure all generated paths are equally spaced along the path. If this is disabled, they will be spaced in the same way as they were generated with the linear path. Most of the time you'll want this option on. And steps will change the amount of generated paths. A bit of a tip. It may be that you want to access one of the generated shapes. In that case, all you have to do is to transform it to a pure path by going to Path, Object to Path. All shapes will be their own island inside of the path. So you can just go to Path, Break Apart, to get one object per island. Power Mask is the mask analog to Power Clip. It just does the exact same but for a mask, with some specific functionality related to masking. It's also deceptively confusing to use, even with only 4 options in the dialog. You have to switch around background opacity and inversion and background. I've never encountered an occasion where I thought it was useful, so I'll do you a favor and we're just gonna skip it. Don't use this effect. That's not worth it in my opinion. Slice will split the path in two, similar to using a division with a line path, but on real time and non-destructive, and also worse in every way because you can only split along a straight line. After it's been applied to a path, we adjust the location of the slice by moving this line. This line is not a path, its length has no effect on the slicing, and you cannot edit it. You can also only change the angle. If you have enabled Allow Transformations, you will be able to use this object tool to do some transformations like rotating and scaling. Other than that, you have options to set this line to vertical or horizontal. As I say, I don't think this effect is that useful. VonKoch generates a fractal shape out of the path you have selected. It is a bit complicated to control in my experience, especially if you mess up with the control paths, and a very niche tool, so I like to avoid it if possible. Once applied, you can control the location, size, and rotation with the control paths. And to be able to edit it, you have to click on this button on the reference segment section. It's a bit unpredictable to control, just mess around with it until it moves where you want it. You can also edit the two generated branches by clicking on this button on the Generating Paths section. Again, kinda weird to control. The only option I would recommend you to mess with here is the number of generations, which control how many subpaths are created. Though if you increase too much this number, then the generated path will disappear. Apparently the quantity of generations are limited by the number in max complexity input. So if you increase the number of generations and they disappear, just set a higher number on this input. I got no idea why there is an input box to limit the quantity of generated paths. I guess one reason could be that generating or manipulating too many copies could freeze the program or something. Fill between many will create a fill that can be applied to multiple open paths. This effect is used to close a path that was opened by other effects like power stroke, but it can be useful on its own. To use it, you first need a random shape that will be transformed into the fill. Then you copy all the paths that delineate the area you want, go to the effect options, and click on this button to paste those paths, and the fill will be generated. Of course, you can edit the path if you want, and the fill will follow. By default, the fill will be placed on top of the paths. You can send them below if you want. A little tip here: if you want to keep the generated fill on top and be able to easily select the path obscured by it, remember that you can hold Alt while you click to select an object that's below in the stack order. You cannot edit the fill shape itself, you can select it independently from the other paths, and you can move it and transform it with the object tool, and Inkscape will automatically adjust the other paths as if they were a single object. This is also a great way to fill any open area that you cannot fill by enabling a fill. For example, any ring like this one can be filled with this effect. Regarding the options in the Path Effect menu, everything is fine as it is, you don't need to touch anything else. Mirror Symmetry is just a very powerful symmetry effect. You control the mirroring with this control line by adjusting the location and angle. But if you go to this dropdown, you have other less useful modes. In my opinion, they are not worth it, just stick to the first one, freely defined mirror line. If you need an exact vertical or horizontal mirroring, just use these buttons down here that say vertical and horizontal center. One option that's extremely useful here is Fuse Paths. This will make it so the paths cannot go past the symmetry line, which is most of the time what you want. Then you have the options to split the element to adjust the style by separate. This option appears in a few other effects we saw. Remember that you can only change the style properties, not the geometry. And link styles will undo this and apply the style of the original into the copy. Rotate copies will create a circle with copies of your original path. This is basically an extension of the previous effect to radial symmetry. Once applied, you'll see this open triangle that you will use to control it. This time-bound control will define the center of the symmetry. With the other triangle, you will rotate it. One thing to keep in mind is that when you rotate them, the original location of the path is still in its position. So this is another effect where you may want to enable Show Path Outline in the tool controls of the Node tool. There are other methods of rotation that you may want to experiment with in the methods dropdown. Fuse will make it so the entire circle will rotate around the original. This means that it will lock its rotation in place. Kaleidoscope will also lock them in place, but it will make it so only the section of the original that's showing inside of the triangle will be duplicated to the other copies, leading to some really funky results. Number of copies will adjust the amount of copies you get. By default, Distribute Evenly is enabled. I've tried to mess around with this option and I don't get what it does. Whether it's enabled or not, the effect just behaves identically for me. I thought to mention it because it seems important. Mirror copies will mirror every other copy for some interesting results. And you have the split elements and link style checkboxes that you are probably familiar by now. In case you skip to this effect, split elements will allow you to give each one of them different color and stroke, but not change its geometry. And link style will revert that. Stitch Sub-Path is one of those bizarre path effects. It creates multiple lines going from one subpath to another, I guess to create some sort of stitch look. You need to have at least 2 path islands. Remember that you can create path made of multiple islands by selecting 2 or more paths and going to Path, Combine. Now these are combined into a single path made of multiple islands. Now you can apply the effect. If once applied you don't see anything, that's because this effect generates only strokes, so you need to give it a stroke color. Because this effect do not show the original path, you may want to enable Show Path Outline in the tool controls of the Node tool. To understand what it is doing, you'll need to increase a lot the number of paths with this input box. As you'll see, this is certainly an interesting looking effect, if not a bit too niche. Start edge variance and end edge variance will variate the location of each line in either the starting shape or the ending shape. Start spacing variance and end spacing variance will variate the spacing of each line in either the starting shape or the ending shape. But you can also use a path, which may be more interesting. The effect does not supply a path, so you have to have your own ready. Just copy it, and then go to the effect dialog, and hit this button. Now all the lines will use the path instead of strokes. Now you can give them fill and a stroke. One quick tip here. Pretty much the only use I can think for this effect right now is using it to create this sort of look, where one island is inside of another. And this looks really good when you use a nice custom path. Anyway, you can make the paths bigger or smaller by scaling them with scale width. And if you want to preserve the shape of the custom path as you spread the islands apart, you can enable scale width, which will do just that. And that was it for the generate category of the path effects. We still have the convert category to cover, but we'll see that on the next video. Hello everybody! This is the fourth video in a series where I show every single path effect in Inkscape. Now it's time to take a look at all effects in the final category, convert. There is one last category that's not really a category, the experimental effects. Let me know in the comments if you would like me to cover it as an extra for this series. And since you're there commenting, make sure to like and subscribe for more videos on Inkscape and illustration. It really helps me and the channel grow. Attach path will create a new segment and attach it to another path. This effect does something similar to what the button Join Selected Endnodes with a New Segment in the tool controls of the Node tool does. This is another one of those incredibly useless path effects that makes you question why they were included. After applied, you'll need to supply the other path which will receive the new segment. Just copy it. In the Path Effects dialog, you have two identical set of options. One for the segment that will be generated from the start node, and another for the segment that will be generated from the end node. Depending on which of these two buttons you press, you'll be generating the segment from different nodes. The first and last node of a path are based on the order which you drew them. If the path is closed, then the effect will treat the starting and ending path as the same. Now with the effect working, you see these two yellow diamonds per path. One of the diamonds controls where in the path it will be stocked, and the other one controls the shape of this segment. It is kinda difficult to control, because this isn't just a normal segment. After playing with it for a few moments, you realize that you can control everything about its shape with this diamond, except for the beginning. For that, sadly, you'll need to come to the options in the Path Effect dialog. What you want to control are these two options in the Start Path Curve Start and End Path Curve Start that says Angle and Distance. A quick tip, if you want it to have the same behavior than a corner type, set these two values to 0. One final warning about this effect. You can drag both segments to the start and end of the other path, but this will not close it. If you try to make any style change, you should see that it only makes it to the path with the effect applied. This is yet another of those path effects that got me scratching my head at the inclusion, because I cannot think of a single reason to use it over just doing things manually. Construct Grid will build a grid following the angle made by the location of the first 3 nodes in a path. This one is actually really useful to learn, especially if you want to draw in an isometric perspective. The path does not have to be straight or have corner nodes, or even be open for this path effect to work. Like I said, it will take the first 3 nodes and it will make a grid using its location, Because of that, it's recommended that you use a simple 3-node straight path, just so it's easier to control. After it's been applied, you control its shape by manipulating the location of these 3 nodes. The only option in the path effect dialog is the size. And that's it. It's a super easy and fast way to build isometric grids. Ellipse from point is a very robust way to build any type of ellipses. This effect is great for putting ellipses in perspective. You can make an ellipse with a path with as little as 2 nodes, but in order to take full advantage of all options, I strongly recommend you to use an open path with 4 nodes. I also recommend you to enable Show Path Outline in the tool controls of the node tool, just so you can see better the order of the nodes that you will use to control it. The first option that you should be aware of is the method. Different methods will have different options and ways to control the ellipse. There are a total of 5 different modes. Auto Ellipse and Force Circle both do the exact same thing. I can't notice a difference. This will just make a perfect circle. You can mess around with the location of the nodes to change its location and scale. With either method selected, you have some options that should feel very familiar if you played with the built-in ellipse. Arc, Other Side Arc, and Slice Arc. The Arc checkbox will build an arc, instead of a closed circle. Now you have either the end or start node to control how close the arc is gonna be. Other Side Arc will invert the arc, and Slice Arc will just close around its center. You need to have checked Arc to have the options to use Other Side Arc and Slice Arc. Let's move to the next mode for now. Isometric Ellipse will use 3 nodes to define a plane that the ellipse will conform to. Great to fit the ellipse into an isometric grid. The frame and axis options were available for the previous method we saw, but it makes more sense when used with an ellipse in perspective. Frame will just show the frame of the ellipse. This is helpful to fit maybe in a perspective grid. Axis will show the 2 axes, letting you know where the ellipse is pointing to. Useful when working in perspective. Then there is another option that could be useful, axis rotation. This will just rotate the ellipse. This will not change its form, it will still adjust to the position of the nodes, but again, it may be helpful when placing it in perspective. Perspective will take the 4 nodes locations, and it will make a plane with them where the ellipse fits in. This is more useful to place the ellipse in proper perspective with accurate perspective distortion. This option also gives you access to these 2 checkboxes that are similar to the previous checkboxes we saw, but fit into proper perspective. Perspective square will show the outline of the plane where the ellipse fits in, useful to put it in perspective, and perspective axis show the axis of the plane, again useful to place the ellipse. The other method, Steiner Ellipse, will just make an ellipse based on 3 nodes. And Steiner Interellipse will do the same but generate the ellipse inside of the 3 nodes. Joint type just handles the joins and gaps using a path effect. This is another effect that has me questioning the reason behind it. Basically it does just that, allows you to control the join and gap and other properties that you will find in the Fill and Stroke Style tab. To be honest, there is a couple of extra options that are not in there, but they are not that useful and it lacks some options that you find in that tab. So I don't know why anyone would want to use this effect. Maybe it is meant to be used by other tools or operations of the program. Some effects do that, as you'll see in a minute. Show handles will show icons related to the path right on top. Mostly it is used to show the location of the nodes and handles and the type of node. This is one of those niche effects that's used for particular things. It is not that useful for everyday drawing, that's why I won't go in depth in this video. Bspline will transform a normal path into a B-spline, which is a path that is controlled entirely by the corners. You do not have direct control over the shape, instead you control the nodes, which now have a weight value attached that determines how much affects that area. If you try to change the location of the handles, you see that it's not possible. They are locked into position. Again, with this effect you don't handle the path directly. What you can do is to use the handles to quickly change how much weight that corner has. Just hold Ctrl and drag. You'll notice that it snaps 2 times along the segment and then it snaps on the other corner, disappearing. If you want finer control over the weight, you can use the input box steps with Ctrl, which handle just that. You can also change the weight of all the corners at once with the change weight %. With the button Make Cusp, you eliminate all weight from all corners. This will make all sharp corners. Or you can use the button Default Weight to set all corners to the default weight, which is 33%. You do have the ability to use any of these options, but only on selected nodes by checking Change Only Selected Nodes. What's interesting about this effect is that you can use it to draw B-splines directly with the pen tool. In the tool controls of the pen tool, you'll see a few buttons to select the modes. The third one allows you to draw directly using B-splines. And what this mode does is applying this path effect on the fly, saving you the extra step of applying it to your shape. Once the shape is drawn, you can see the effect applied and you can see and change the properties we just saw. Really useful. Dashed strikes gives the path dashes. Just like the join type effect we just saw, this is basically the path effect version of some of the properties in the Style tab of the Fill and Stroke dialog. However, this time there are some minor differences that worth a deeper look. You have more control over the way the dashes look. By using the number of dashes input box, you can set the amount of dashes. And by using the hole factor input box, you control the size of the holes. Another very useful option is Use Segment that apply these properties to the individual segments rather than the entire path. This is enabled by default and it's the recommended option. One unintended effect of enabling this option that I think is pretty useful is that now there are no holes on the corners, which always bothers me when using dashes. Half start end makes it so all corners have a half dash, and equalized dashes make all dashes have the same length no matter the length of the segment, which will break the number of dashes and holes set, but it will make it nice looking. There's one downside of using this effect instead of the traditional dashes, and that is that you cannot give it fill properly. It's broken. In the options in the effect dialog, it tells you that you should use the fill between many effect if you want a fill. If you would like to know how to use fill between many, check out the previous video in this series, linked to the path effect playlist in the description. Gears is a bit of a bizarre effect that transforms all nodes of a path into a gear. The gears are placed on the location of the nodes, adjusting its size and number of teeth according to the location of the nodes and the space between other nodes. The effect will try to place everything neatly together, but it is possible that some gear is missing or there is some overlapping because there was no space. The amount of teeth is also calculated depending on the size of the gear, and each teeth will try to fit in between other gears' teeth. On top of the teeth generated automatically, you can also add or remove by playing with the teeth input box. While you do not have control over the shape of the teeth, with the Phi input, you can make them sharper. This effect is super niche and super janky. I feel that with a bit of retouch this effect could be useful for those very specific occasions where you need gears interlocking with each other, but the lack of customization, especially in the teeth, and the fact that nothing works like it should, makes it a hard pass for me. Measure Segment is a super useful and complete measurements and annotation tool. It takes path and displays measurements of all kinds. I guess mostly to use in architectural blueprints. I'm gonna skip this effect in this video. It's certainly super interesting and it has like a million options, but I feel most people aren't gonna be interested in using it, and it will take a lot of time to cover everything. Just know that this effect is really useful for any time you want to display some sort of measurements or to make any type of blueprint. Spiro Spline will create the spiral shapes based on the location of the nodes. You cannot apply it to an existing path. Instead, you enable this option in the tool controls of the pen tool before you start drawing. And just like with the Bspline options that we saw in the Bspline's path effect, Now you draw with the effect enabled. I find it extremely unpredictable to use, to the point that it's almost useless to me, though I do not discard that this could be a bug, maybe a problem with my PC or with the operating system, because I do remember it used to work better on previous versions of Inkscape, though I don't remember too much because I never used it. You should certainly try it for yourself and see if it works for you. In any case, even after the nodes have been placed, the effect is still enabled, so you can still adjust it and move the nodes around, and the spiral shapes will adjust accordingly. And there are no options in the path effect dialog. Bounding box will just create a box around a path. Another kinda useless effect in my opinion. You first need a random shape that will be transformed into the bounding box. You apply the effect to this shape. Then you copy the path you want to have the bounding box, go to the path effect options and hit this button. Now the bounding box will resize to fit the shape of the other object. The bounding box path is a completely separated path, meaning it can be selected and it can have its own color or stroke. Ellipse by 5 points will create an ellipse using the location of the first 5 nodes in a path. Another useless path effect in my opinion, especially having the ellipse by points effect, which we already saw and is much better. There really isn't that much to this effect. The path has to have at least 5 nodes or the effect will fail. There are no options in the path effect dialog. Avoid it and use ellipse by points instead. Interpolate points will create a new path by interpolating the location of the nodes. That sounds more useful than it is. In reality, more or less what it does is to change slightly the curvature of the segment, as if you were changing the node type. You do have some options to change the type of interpolation, but they don't offer enough control to make it useful for anything. Another effect to avoid. Ruler adds some lines to the strokes to transform them into a ruler. Another path effect to make blueprints or other technical drawings. Even though you can use this effect with multiple segment paths or curves, it has no option to make measurements per object or segment, so most of the time you'll want to use it with a straight line. The unit is probably the most important option here. It sets the unit and the spacing of these lines. If you plan to use it as some kind of blueprint, you probably will want to use a metric measurement like centimeters. Mark distance will define the whole distance that the ruler is measuring, using the set unit. Measure length and minor length will set the length of the small and big lines. Major steps will define every how many small lines there will be a big line. Shift marks by will let you start the ruler with any small line instead of the big one. Offset will move the entire lines to the sides, not jumping from line to line like the previous option. Mark direction lets you set where the lines will show, on top, bottom, or overlapping. And border marks will let you enable or disable the extra lines at the start and end of the path. Really useful effect, especially if you're interested in more technical drawings. And we finally finished our path effect in Inkscape. Hopefully now you're a bit less intimidated by this very powerful tool Inkscape has. Hello there. This video is the 5th and final video in a series of tutorials of the path effects in Inkscape. In this video we'll take a look at all the path effects inside of the final group, labeled as experimental. In the description, I'll leave you a list with all the path effect tutorials. Make sure to check it out. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tutorials on Inkscape and illustration. Angle Bisector will create a path that is in the exact middle of the angle made by the first 3 nodes. I would like to remind you that the first 3 nodes refers to the first nodes you place. If your path has more than 3 nodes, the effect will ignore them and will only use the first 3 ones. This will repeat with most of these mathematical effects in the experimental category that only use a few of the nodes of the path. Very important, This effect, and most of the effects that we're going to see in this category, will destroy the original path when the effect is applied. So just so you can see better what you're doing, I strongly recommend you to leave enabled the option Show Path Outlines in the tool controls of the node tool. This effect don't care about the shape of the segments. They can be curved. The angle is calculated based on the position of the nodes only. Once applied, you can still move the shape of the path and the angle bisector will adapt to the new angle. With these two options, you control where does the angle bisector starts and where does it ends. Extrude lets you make a plane out of a single line. You control the angle and distance with this diamond over here. You can use it with a closed shape, but doesn't work that well because of the direction of the nodes. So you want to use it mostly to transform lines into planes. Parallel will create a stroke parallel to the line made by the first and last node of your path. The path has to be open for the effect to be able to generate the stroke. After applied, you can move the nodes in your path, and the generated stroke will adapt. Notice that all the other nodes in between are completely ignored. The only thing that matters here are the first and last node you drew. This is something that you will see repeated in some of the upcoming path effects. You can move the location of the line with the white diamond, and you can control the length of the left and right side with these input boxes. Circle will create a circle using the first node of the path as the center and the final node as the length of the radius. No options in the path effect dialog. You control the width by changing the radius moving either the first or final node. Fill between strokes will take a path and create a fill for two open paths. This effect is identical to the effect we saw previously, fill between many, from the generate category, but even more limited because it doesn't work between more than two open paths like fill between many. I would recommend you to skip this effect and use that one instead. Perpendicular bisector will just create a perpendicular line between the first and last node of the path. Just like with the other effects, it will completely ignore all the nodes in between and the shape of the segments. You can control its length from the left and right side with the path effect options. Circle by 3 points will create a circle using the first 3 nodes in the path. The circle's circumference will adjust to the position of the first 3 nodes in real time, and like before, it will ignore all the other nodes after that. No options in the path effect dialog. Line segment will create a line between the first and last node of the path. In the path effect dialog options, you have this drop-down that lets you select how the line will be shown. Close will make the line go from node to node. Open both, open left and open right, will make the line go past the nodes. Sadly, there is no way to edit its length like with previous path effects. Tangent will create a line that's tangent to a curve in your path. The path can have multiple segments and be open or closed. Once applied, you move the location of the tangent with the little diamond in the center and the length with the diamonds in the extremes. Using location along curve, you can be more specific with where you want it. The number goes from 0 to the number of segments and works a bit like percentages. So 0.5 will place it in the exact center of the first segment, and 1.5 will place it in the exact center of the second segment, no matter the length. You can also offset the angle with the angle input box. And we are finally done with all path effects, even the experimental ones. I hope these videos were helpful in any way, or at least that they show you something you didn't know about. Path effects are an amazingly powerful feature in Inkscape, and sadly are a bit obscure by the way they are implemented. I would like to remind you that I make tutorials every week, mostly on Inkscape and also illustration, so subscribe and hit the bell if that's something interesting to you. I would highly appreciate any like and comment, it really helps me and the channel grow. Have a great day, bye!